Today we'll witness the forgotten story of the men and women who refused to surrender their land to the banks. Men who had broken their backs to pull food from the soil, and when Wall Street came to take it back, they didn't run. They weren't revolutionaries or politicians, they were farmers. The wind cut through northern Iowa like a blade that winter. January 1933, the sun hung pale over the frozen stubble of last year's corn, and a man named Harold Simmons stood on his porch staring down the rutted road that led to his barn. He'd shaved that morning the way a man does before facing judgment. His wife had tied her hair back with a bit of blue ribbon, though there was no reason to dress up. By noon, they'd lose everything. In the distance came the sound, a low hum of engines, the clatter of a Model A truck, the chug of a tractor. Then the voice of an auctioneer, sharp and practiced, rose above the cold. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin." The camera could have panned across the scene. 20 neighbors in heavy coats, steam rising from their breath. The sheriff stood by his car, stamping his boots against the frost. The bank's man, hat pulled low, held a clipboard like a weapon. Behind him, the Simmons house, hand-built, boards gray from 20 years of weather. Inside that house were birth certificates, a Bible, and a drawer full of unpaid notes. The farm was 160 acres. Black soil, tile drained and mortgaged back in '28 when corn fetched $1 a bushel. Now it was worth 5 cents, and the bank wanted its due. The auctioneer tapped his cane. "We'll start with the horses. Who will give me $50 for the bay mare?" Silence. The only sound was wind in the trees. He tried again. 40? A cough, a shuffle, but no bids. Then from the edge of the crowd, a voice called out, flat, dry, and certain. $1? Heads turned. It was Tom Gerhardt, a neighbor whose own place was half underwater in debt. He stepped forward, hands deep in his pockets, staring straight at the auctioneer. The man looked uncertain. "Do I hear two?" No one spoke. The sheriff's eyes darted to the bank agent, who frowned, realizing what was happening. The farmers had met the night before in the back of the Lutheran church and agreed no outsider would buy what belonged to one of their own. The bidding moved on. Plow, harness, wagon, each sold for pennies. The bank man protested, but the sheriff muttered, "They're bidding fair by the rules." When the last item was done, the crowd gathered around Harold. One by one, they handed back what they'd just bought. The team, the tools, the harness, all returned to him without a word. It was called a penny auction. A quiet rebellion, born of decency. Later that night, the sheriff wired a report to Des Moines saying the sale was disrupted by community interference. But no arrests were made. No violence, just silence, and a kind of stubborn honor the Depression couldn't break. Harold stood by his barn as the last of the headlights disappeared down the road. His wife came out, her hands red from the cold, and asked softly, "What happens now?" He looked over the land, frozen rows, a windmill creaking against the sky. "I guess we plant again," he said. But word spread fast. Within weeks, other farms would face the same fate. And across Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, men began meeting in barns and schoolhouses, swearing they wouldn't let the banks strip another family bare. They had no leaders, no weapons, and no plan beyond loyalty. But something old was stirring in the heartland, the belief that a man's land was sacred, and that the system had forgotten what that meant. They would find out soon enough how far the law would go to prove him wrong. The spring of 1933 brought no mercy. By April, the frost lifted, but the ground underneath was sick, dry, brittle, stripped of its promise. What once was the richest topsoil in the world now blew like ash across the Midwest. The rain had stopped, the prices had collapsed, and the very thing that built America, the land, had turned its back on its own people. Across Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, men rose before dawn to hitch mules that were little more than bones. They plowed because they didn't know what else to do. They plowed because to stop was to admit defeat. The soil crumbled under their boots, a ghost of the black loam that had fed generations. A farmer named Earl Redding, down in Boone County, kept a notebook that spring. In it he wrote, "Corn at 6 cents, hogs at 3, no sale for eggs. Bank says I owe $1,200 by June. I can't see how a man comes back from that." He wasn't alone. There were tens of thousands like him, men who had borrowed small sums when times were good, when America was roaring, when a farm seemed as safe as a vault. But by 1930, the crash had turned optimism into quicksand. Banks called in loans early, credit evaporated, commodity prices fell through the floor. In 1929, the United States had nearly 6.5 million farms. Within 5 years, a third were in foreclosure or default. The countryside, once the symbol of independence, became the front line of economic collapse. And yet what stung more than the drought or the debt was betrayal. The farmers had always been told they were the backbone of the nation. Every 4th of July speech praised the man behind the plow, the producer, the provider, the salt of the earth. But when the crash came, it wasn't the banks that bent. It was the men with dirt on their hands. From the cities, the newspapers called it the readjustment. Economists said it was the natural correction of overproduction. But out in the plains, they called it something else, the squeeze. Because that's what it felt like, a slow, merciless tightening from every side. By midsummer, the dust storms began to rise. It started with a faint haze, then turned the sky brown, then black. Wind tore across the open fields, carrying what was left of the soil to the horizon. Horses turned their backs to it, tails whipping. Children coughed in their beds. Women stuffed rags under doors to keep the grit from covering their tables, their food, their children's faces. It wasn't just bad luck, it was the price of over-farming and industrial optimism. The same progress that made America rich, the tractors, the steel plows, the endless drive to produce more, had gutted the land. And in that ruin, the banks came calling again. Courthouse steps became stages of humiliation. Farmers watched strangers buy the fields they'd cleared by hand. Their tools, their barns, their livestock sold to pay debts that had doubled in value as the dollar tightened. In some towns, sheriffs refused to serve foreclosure papers. In others, they didn't have the choice. Deputies would arrive in Model T trucks, armed with writs and rifles to restore order. The camera might linger here, on a child's face pressed to the window, watching her father's plow hauled away by the bank. On a woman sweeping dust from the floor that never stayed clean. On a man standing in a field of nothing, hands at his sides, the world silent but for the sound of the wind. That's when something inside the countryside began to shift. It wasn't just hunger anymore, it was anger. In coffee shops and county fairs, in Grange halls and Sunday pews, they began to talk. The word fairness came up more than profit. They spoke of taking back their land, of standing together, of making the system listen for once. Out of that despair rose the first whispers of organization, quiet, cautious, but growing. The Farm Holiday Association, the Farmers Union, the Grange, names that had been fading since the 1890s now carried new weight. And the men who had been too proud to ask for help began to realize that the only way to survive was to stand as one. That summer, as another sheriff's auction loomed in Sioux County, a rumor spread. If the banks were going to take another man's farm, they'd have to walk through a wall of farmers to do it. Next time, the crowd wouldn't be silent. Next time, the sheriff wouldn't walk in alone. The road to the Peterson farm was narrow and lined with cottonwoods. On the morning of May 30, 1933, the sheriff's Ford coupe rumbled over the gravel, trailing a cloud of dust behind it. Inside sat Sheriff Earl Warren of Sioux County, a man not yet 40, tired beyond his years. He wasn't the villain the farmers thought he was. He'd grown up among them, his hands once calloused from hay hooks and barbed wire. But now he wore a badge, and that meant he carried the law. The foreclosure papers in his glove box were for Jacob and Marie Peterson, second-generation farmers who owed $900 on 80 acres near Hawarden. The bank in Des Moines had given no choice. Orders were orders. But that morning, when Warren topped the hill, he saw something that stopped him cold. Across the Peterson lane, 200 men stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the path. Pitchforks, rakes, and shovels glinted in the light. At the front, a gray-haired man held a sign nailed to a fence post that read, "We plowed this land before they printed their money." The sheriff braked, engine sputtering to a stop. His deputy swallowed hard beside him. They'd heard rumors for weeks that farmers were meeting in barns at night, forming farm defense councils, taking oaths to protect their neighbors from eviction. But no one had expected this. Warren opened his door slowly. "Morning, boys," he said, voice low, controlled. "No one wants trouble today." The crowd didn't move. A dog barked in the distance. At the back of the line, women stood with their arms folded, flour dusted from baking bread at dawn, because even in defiance, they fed the men who fought for them. Finally, Jacob Peterson stepped forward. His coat was buttoned wrong, his eyes rimmed red. "Sheriff, you know what's right," he said. "I've worked this ground since I was 10. You think a man in Des Moines deserves it more than I do?" Warren sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Jake, I got a court order, signed by a judge. You know what happens if I turn around?" Jacob looked him in the eye. "Yeah, maybe this time the law turns around too." There was no shouting, no chaos, just a terrible quiet. Then one by one the men began stepping closer, boots crunching on gravel, pitchforks lowering slightly but steady. The deputy whispered, "Sheriff, we can't push through that." And Warren knew he was right. He could read their faces. These weren't desperate drifters or agitators from the city. They were neighbors, God-fearing, tax-paying, war-serving Americans who had reached their limit. He took a long breath, pulled the keys from the ignition, and said, "All right then." He turned the car around. The crowd parted, watching in silence as the sheriff's coupe disappeared down the road. No cheers, no triumph, just a deep shared relief. That night, the farmers met again in the Peterson barn. They nailed boards over the windows and lit a kerosene lamp. The air was thick with sweat, smoke, and fear. A local feed dealer named Albert Hovland stood up and said, "They can't foreclose on us all. We'll stand watch. Every man here swears to show up when the next one's threatened." It was the birth of something bigger. A movement without uniforms, without leaders, but with a code. They called it the Pitchfork Army, though no one knew who coined the term. It wasn't a mob. It was a wall of desperation forged into unity. Within weeks, similar standoffs broke out across the Midwest. In Boone, Fort Dodge, Worthington, Pipestone, the same pattern repeated. Sheriff drives out. Farmers gather. Court orders burn quietly in iron stoves. Local newspapers called it anarchy. But to the farmers, it was justice. When asked by a Des Moines Register reporter why he defied the court, one old man said, "Because courts don't grow corn, men do." The movement spread faster than the law could keep up. Bankers began hiring armed guards. Governors dispatched state troopers to keep order. But the harder the system pushed, the more the countryside resisted. The Depression had driven them past the line of obedience. And now, for the first time since the Civil War, parts of rural America were beginning to govern themselves. Out on the prairie, under moonlight and frost, groups of farmers met in silence, swapping watch schedules, guarding roads and keeping ledgers of which farms were next to be saved. One sheriff years later recalled, "There were nights you couldn't tell where the law stopped and the people started." But even as these quiet victories mounted, there was a deeper truth waiting: that courage alone couldn't pay the bank's interest, and solidarity couldn't fill an empty ledger. The system would strike back soon, not with words but with force. Because across the border in Minnesota, one farm auction had turned violent, and the newspapers were about to call it a riot. The courthouse bell in Lamar's, Iowa rang noon as if nothing had changed. But down the road, on a farm just outside town, something very old and very American was being reborn. The air was thick with dust and resolve. It was July 1933, one of the hottest summers on record. Corn leaves hung like ribbons, the color of old paper. The sheriff's truck came rattling down the lane, the bed piled high with foreclosure notices and an auctioneer's podium lashed with rope. Inside the farmhouse, the Larson family waited in silence. Henry Larson, age 51, had already taken off his hat, not out of surrender but respect. His wife Anna clutched the family Bible in her lap. The kids, pale and quiet, stood near the window. They'd known this day was coming, everyone had. But when the first strangers appeared over the hill, they weren't buyers, they were neighbors, dozens of them, arriving by wagon, on horseback, in dented Fords, in overalls and Sunday coats. By the time the sheriff parked, more than 300 people stood in the yard. The auctioneer, a small man in a straw hat, cleared his throat. "Let's keep this civil," he said. "The bank's here to settle accounts." He set his gavel on the stand and began. "Lot 1, a team of bay geldings, 4 years old. Who'll start me at 50? No one spoke. He looked around, uncertain, then lowered. 40? Still nothing. Finally, a man in the front, old Bill Rehnquist, who had fought in France, raised one finger. $1. The auctioneer blinked. "Sir, that's $1, Bill repeated. The crowd murmured approval. The auctioneer tried to continue, but each item went the same way. Plow, $1. Hay rake, $1. Milk cow, $1. Household goods, $1. When a local banker tried to step forward with a legitimate bid, a wall of farmers closed ranks in front of him. No words, no threat, just a silent line of men who had decided that some prices weren't negotiable. At the end, the entire farm, every fence post, tool, and animal was sold for less than $20. The auctioneer, red-faced and sweating, scribbled the totals, then looked up helplessly as each buyer handed their purchase back to Henry Larson. The sheriff, leaning against his truck, just shook his head. He'd seen worse that year, and he wasn't about to make enemies of the only decent people left in the county. "Looks like the sale's concluded," he muttered. "Let's get out of here." When the trucks were gone, the farmers stayed. They didn't celebrate. They didn't smile. They simply walked back to their fields, because that was what came next. That night, in farmhouses across Iowa, the word spread. It traveled by letter, by church meeting, by whispered phone calls through party lines. We held a penny auction, and it worked. By fall, hundreds of these penny auctions had taken place across the Midwest, from Nebraska to Wisconsin, from the Dakotas to Kansas. Each one followed the same script. Neighbors filled the yard before the sheriff arrived. Bidding started low, never above a few cents. No outsiders bid. If they tried, they were quietly warned, "You don't want that kind of trouble." And when the sale ended, the property returned to its rightful owner. No one wrote down the rules. No one signed their name, but everyone understood them. It was democracy stripped to its bones. One community deciding that justice mattered more than law. The newspapers in Des Moines called it organized intimidation. Wall Street called it rural lawlessness. But the people in the farmhouses called it something else. They called it fair, because for the first time in years, they were winning. No bullets, no marches, no blood, just solidarity and silence. The banks began to panic. Reports poured into governors' offices. Entire counties refusing to cooperate with foreclosures. Sheriffs afraid to serve papers. Farmers defying the courts. Some states, desperate to maintain order, passed moratoriums on foreclosures, temporary relief that kept families on their land. But the movement was spreading too fast. In Minnesota, one penny auction had turned ugly when a judge refused to halt a sale. He was dragged from the bench by a crowd of farmers and forced to sign a stay order at gunpoint. The story made national headlines. Washington took notice, so did the FBI. Yet behind the sensationalism was something quieter, a moral uprising, rooted not in rebellion but in the belief that America was supposed to mean something better. One farmer wrote in his journal, after a penny auction near Ames, "If a man's word ain't worth more than a banker's note, then we've already lost this country." Still, the pressure was mounting. The banks weren't done, neither was the government. And as the penny auctions grew bolder, the line between decency and defiance began to blur. Because soon the men with ledgers would return, this time with state troopers and injunctions in their pockets. And they'd come not just to take the land, but to make an example of those who stood against them. By the winter of 1933, the countryside had grown restless, and the banks embarrassed. They had lost too many auctions, too much control, too much face, to men who measured worth in ledgers and signatures. The idea that farmers could defy the system with nothing but loyalty and silence was intolerable. And so they decided to fight back. The first wave came quietly, injunctions. Judges began issuing orders forbidding interference with foreclosure sales. Newspapers in Des Moines and Minneapolis ran editorials calling the penny auctions mob rule. To the bankers, it was never about hunger or fairness. It was about precedent. If one farmer could keep his land through defiance, others might follow. The second wave came harder. Deputized men. Courthouses filled with uneasy volunteers wearing tin stars, some local, others hired from neighboring counties. They were told they were protecting the law, but most just wanted the $5 a day and a hot meal. And then came violence. In February 1934, a convoy of trucks rolled into Lamars, Iowa, the same town that had hosted one of the earliest penny auctions. Inside those trucks sat state troopers in leather coats, rifles slung across their laps. They weren't there to negotiate. They were there to enforce a foreclosure by any means necessary. At dawn, they surrounded a small farm belonging to Martin Tripp, a quiet man known more for his corn yields than his words. When the sheriff read the order, the family stood on the porch. Behind them, a dozen neighbors gathered, then 2 dozen, then 50. Someone shouted, "Go home, we're not moving." The troopers fanned out, boots crunching in the frost. The smell of oil and fear hung in the air. One farmer stepped forward with a pitchfork, not raised, just held, steady. A trooper swung his rifle butt, catching him in the shoulder. The man fell hard, his breath gone in the cold. That was all it took. The line surged. Shouts, fists, dust. And for a few terrible seconds, the Great Depression turned into a battlefield. When the chaos settled, 2 men were injured. A trooper's hat lay trampled in the mud, and the sheriff stood shaking, his order unread. By nightfall, the state capitol declared rural insurrection. Governor Clyde Herring, a Democrat trying to walk the razor's edge between sympathy and control, addressed the press that week. "These are hard times, but the law must not yield to disorder. No man can set himself above it." The farmers heard the broadcast on battery radios in dark kitchens. To them, it sounded like betrayal, wrapped in politics. In response, they grew more organized. The Farm Holiday Association, founded a year earlier by a fiery Nebraskan named Milo Reno, gained members by the thousands. Reno's message was simple: stay home, buy nothing, sell nothing, until prices rise. It was the farmers' version of a strike. And in the summer of 1934, it turned the highways of Iowa into battlegrounds. Farmers parked tractors across county roads. They dumped milk in ditches rather than sell it for pennies. In some towns, they set up checkpoints, allowing only doctors, priests, and undertakers to pass. In Council Bluffs, a truck carrying cream bound for Omaha was stopped by a mob of farmers. The driver, shaking, told them he had 3 kids to feed. An older man put a hand on his shoulder and said, "So do we." Then they tipped the cream into the dust. The newspapers printed photographs of it, milk flowing down the roadside like white blood. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To the farmers, it was survival. The bankers doubled down. They called for federal marshals. They called for more troops. They called it sedition. But every time they did, they pushed the countryside closer to explosion. In Plymouth County, the courthouse itself was besieged. Hundreds of farmers surrounded the building, demanding relief. Inside, terrified officials signed emergency postponements on farm sales. When the judge hesitated, he was pulled from his chair and dragged to the window. The crowd shouted for mercy, not vengeance. Sign it and go home safe." He signed, and in that single act, a man of law acknowledged the power of those without it. The state responded by calling in the National Guard. Soldiers with fixed bayonets lined courthouse steps that winter, their breath steaming in the air as farmers stood watching, unarmed, unblinking. It was a stalemate, rifles against conscience. But as spring came, hunger returned. The movement was splintering. Some leaders wanted negotiation, others wanted confrontation. And through it all, President Franklin Roosevelt was listening, cautious, calculating, waiting to see whether this was rebellion or a cry for help. The banks had flexed their muscle. The farmers had shown their backbone. Now the nation itself would have to choose which side it was on. Because one more hard season could break the standoff, and maybe the country with it. The sun came up red that summer, heavy, swollen, the color of warning. It was August 1932, the heart of the farmers' holiday, and across the middle of America, the roads themselves had become front lines. From the air, if anyone had been flying then, you would have seen it clearly. The grid of the Midwest, all those narrow veins of gravel and tar, clogged with tractors and hay wagons, every intersection manned by farmers who had laid down their plows to stand guard over their future. A sign outside Harlan read, "Road closed till justice opens it." Another in Council Bluffs, "Stay home, buy nothing, sell nothing." The movement had started as a whisper, the dream of one stubborn man from Iowa named Milo Reno. Reno wasn't a politician. He was a Methodist, a populist, a voice roughened by years of stump speeches and hard weather. He'd seen neighbors lose their land to the same banks that Washington had just bailed out, and he'd had enough. When the Farm Holiday Association held its first rally in Des Moines, the crowd numbered a few hundred. By midsummer, it was tens of thousands. Farmers from as far away as the Dakotas and Kansas arrived in battered trucks, waving homemade banners, shouting a holiday for justice. Reno's plan was radical, but simple. "If they won't pay us fair prices for what we grow," he said, "then we stop growing it for them." It wasn't a protest, it was an embargo. They refused to sell milk, eggs, corn, or wheat until prices rose to cover their costs. Milk was worth less than water. Corn sold for pennies a bushel. Wheat rotted in silos while families lived on cornbread and borrowed hope. So, they shut it down. Farmers blocked highways leading into Sioux City, Des Moines, and Omaha. They overturned trucks carrying produce to the city markets. If a driver tried to run the blockade, his cargo didn't make it. Cans of milk were dumped into ditches, hogs were turned loose, and grain sacks were slit open, spilling golden kernels into the dust. To the newspapers, it was shocking. To the farmers, it was justice. One man told a reporter, "I'd rather pour it on the ground than sell it for less than what it took to raise it." By the third week, Iowa was paralyzed. No milk, no butter, no eggs. The cities began to feel what the countryside had endured for years: scarcity. Governor Clyde Herring tried to calm the storm, urging patience, negotiation, but patience had long since been plowed under. In Denison, state troopers were sent to clear a roadblock. The farmers refused to move. The troopers advanced, rifles raised but not fired. A shove, a scuffle. Then a man went down, his head striking a hubcap. Blood pooled on the gravel. That moment broke something. By evening, 25 towns across Iowa erupted in sympathy. Courthouses were surrounded, telephone lines jammed with calls for unity. At one blockade, a woman climbed onto the hood of a car and shouted through tears, "You can't eat your laws, boys. You can't feed your kids on promises." It became the cry of the movement. But the farmers' holiday wasn't just a protest. It was a moral reckoning. For the first time, the backbone of America, the independent farmer, had turned his back on the very economy he had built. In a single week, more than 10,000 farms joined the strike. Tractors stood idle in rows. Granaries filled with unsold grain. Towns that depended on those farms went silent. Feed stores, banks, diners all shuttered. Then came the backlash. Business owners begged Reno to call it off. The press branded the strikers agrarian anarchists. The governor threatened to call out the National Guard. But Reno stood firm. He told a crowd in Atlantic, Iowa, "If a man's labor isn't worth the price of his bread, then he's not free, he's a slave in overalls." The crowd roared. For a few short months, it felt as though the farmers had finally seized the steering wheel of their own destiny. They weren't begging for mercy, they were demanding fairness. And for the first time, Washington listened. The Roosevelt administration, still new and scrambling to stabilize the economy, began to pay attention. The president's advisors reported that the heartland was at the edge of revolt. One memo warned that if conditions didn't improve, the next step might not be peaceful. So the first gestures came. Quiet, bureaucratic, but real. Price supports, farm credit talks, the first drafts of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. But on the ground, the movement was fraying. Winter was coming. Families couldn't eat pride forever. And as the blockade stretched into months, cracks began to show. Some farmers crossed their own lines, sneaking milk into town after dark just to buy shoes for their children. By late fall, the holiday was ending. Not defeated, but worn out. The roads opened, the trucks rolled again, the markets filled, but something had changed that no bank ledger could erase. The farmers had found their voice. They had discovered the power of saying no. And though their bodies were tired, their resolve was hardening into something more lasting, a new demand that Washington couldn't ignore. Because now, the cry for justice had reached the White House itself, and the man who listened more closely than anyone else would soon turn that cry into policy. But before Washington acted, the heartland would face its darkest winter yet, a season of arrests, blacklists, and broken promises. The snow came early in 1934, heavy, wet, relentless. It fell across Iowa and Nebraska like a final insult, burying the furrows that hadn't yielded enough to cover a single debt note. The roads froze over, the mail stopped coming, and the towns that had once buzzed with protest now sounded hollow, muffled by cold and by fear. The farmers' holiday was over, but its aftermath, the reckoning, had just begun. Sheriff's cars returned to the countryside, this time not to negotiate. Arrest warrants in hand, they went after the men who had stood in the road that summer, who had blocked trucks, who had defied court orders. Dozens were rounded up under charges like conspiracy to obstruct commerce, rioting, and interference with lawful process. To a nation weary of chaos, these were just lines in the paper. But in the town halls and jails of western Iowa, those lines had faces. One of them was John Red Hovland, a Norwegian-descended farmer from near Harlan. He'd helped organize one of the first blockades, a man of quiet strength and slow words. When they came for him, he didn't resist. He just kissed his wife's forehead, buttoned his coat and said, "Feed the cattle, I won't be long." But he was wrong. Hovland spent that winter in a county jail cell with a cracked window that let the snow drift in at night. He was sentenced to 6 months for inciting economic disorder. When the local paper printed his mugshot, the editor added a note at the bottom. "We all know this man. We also know he's no criminal." Across the plains, that became the unspoken truth. Everyone knew someone behind bars. Men who had worked dawn to dusk their whole lives, now branded as agitators. The irony stung like frostbite. When they'd fed the nation, they'd been called the backbone of America. Now that they refused to be broken, they were called radicals. And yet, in the bitter cold, their families carried on. Women like Anna Peterson, whose husband had been arrested at a penny auction, kept the lamps lit and the barns warm with what little coal they had left. She took in sewing for neighbors. She traded jars of pickled beets for flour. On Sundays, she and the other wives would meet at the church basement to pray, not for forgiveness, but for courage. Children learned early that winter how to keep secrets. When the teacher asked where their fathers were, they'd say, "Working in town." No one pressed, everyone knew. Meanwhile, in Des Moines and Washington, the tide of public sympathy began to shift. Even newspaper editors, once harsh critics of the farm mobs, now wrote editorials questioning the morality of jailing men for wanting a fair price. President Franklin Roosevelt, still in his first year in office, read those reports carefully. He had already begun to see the heartland not as a riotous fringe, but as a warning from the ground up. He told Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace, himself an Iowan, "If the farmer fails, the nation fails next." And so, in the heart of that terrible winter, the administration began quietly building relief programs that would carry the farmers through the next planting season. But that was politics. On the ground in those dark farmhouses, the struggle was more immediate: wood to burn, cornmeal to stretch, faith to hold. Some gave up, packed their things, moved to the city. They joined the endless stream of families heading west, dust-coated, hungry, their wagons creaking along the frozen highways toward a promise that no longer existed. Others refused to leave, even as hunger hollowed their faces. One farmer near Sac City carved these words into the lintel of his barn that winter: "I will not leave what I have buried here." Inside, under the hay, were the ashes of his mortgage papers burned on the night his farm was saved by a penny auction. That defiance, though dimmed, still burned across the frozen plains. And by the time the snow melted, it would meet something unexpected: the sound of federal trucks arriving, bearing new hope in the form of loans, relief, and something the farmers hadn't seen in years: acknowledgement. But before hope came, one more chapter had to be written. A bridge between defiance and reform, between rebellion and recognition. It would be written not in blood this time, but in policy. In the language of Washington, but born from the cry of the land. Washington, D.C., spring of 1934. The cherry trees bloomed along the Potomac, their petals falling like soft snow onto a Capitol, struggling to believe it still ran the country. The Depression had humbled every class of American, but none more loudly than the farmers. They had marched, shouted, blocked roads, and stopped sales. And though the East dismissed it as agrarian unrest, the truth was simpler: the countryside had reached the end of its rope. That message had crossed the plains on telegraph wires, through reporters' notebooks, and in letters scrawled in pencil on brown paper. Letters that landed on the desk of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR had read many things in his life, but few letters struck him like the ones from the Farm Belt. They weren't written in policy language. They were written in the blunt tone of men who had done their duty and been betrayed. One letter from Carroll County read, "Mr. President, I fought in France and came home to work the same land my father cleared. The bank took it. They say I owe $1,800. I don't know what money is anymore, but I know what sweat is." Roosevelt kept that one. He was a patrician, a Hudson Valley aristocrat who had never known drought or hunger. Yet he understood politics the way a farmer understands weather. He knew when a storm was coming, and this one was rising from the prairie. So he acted. Under his orders, Henry A. Wallace, Secretary of Agriculture, an Iowa-born plant geneticist who had grown up among the very men now on the brink, began shaping programs to save them. Out of endless nights of drafting and argument came the Farm Credit Administration, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and a series of emergency moratoriums that for the first time in years gave farmers breathing room. The Farm Credit Administration, established in 1933 but expanded in 1934, was Roosevelt's quiet revolution. It refinanced farm mortgages at lower rates, stopped foreclosures cold, and created local credit offices staffed by men who knew the smell of silage, not just the ink of ledgers. To the farmers, those offices were more than government outposts. They were lifelines. One farmer near Mason City later said, "When that letter came with the seal and said the government was backing my loan, I sat down at the table and cried. Didn't think I had tears left." The Agricultural Adjustment Act went even further. It paid farmers to leave parts of their land fallow, to reduce supply and raise prices. Critics in the cities called it madness, paying men not to work. But those who lived by the plow knew what it meant. Finally, the government was acknowledging that food had value, that labor had worth again. Roosevelt didn't just hand out checks, he changed the tone. In his fireside chats broadcast over radios crackling in farmhouse kitchens, he spoke directly to them. "Our farmers are the stewards of the soil," he said. "When we save the farmer, we save the foundation of America itself." And for the first time in a long while, people believed him. The protest began to fade. The roads reopened, penny auctions grew rare, not because men lost courage, but because they could finally breathe again. In courthouse towns across the Midwest, judges began suspending foreclosure sales, some quietly, others proudly. The tension that had once made men grab pitchforks now turned into something quieter but more enduring: participation. Farmers began attending county meetings again, running for local boards, managing co-ops, and steering credit associations. The same men who had once defied the law were now helping to write it. But not everyone trusted Roosevelt's salvation. Some saw it as a dangerous pact, the farmer trading independence for government aid. Others feared that the small, self-reliant way of life would dissolve into bureaucracy. A letter published in the Cedar Rapids Gazette captured that unease. "I thank the president for saving my land. But if he keeps saving it, one day it won't be mine anymore." That worry lingered, unspoken but alive, even as new hope returned to the countryside. Because though the checks helped, the land was still scarred. The drought hadn't ended. Dust storms still rolled in from the west, great walls of brown that swallowed fences, houses, and hope. And while Roosevelt's alphabet agencies fought to mend the economy, something deeper was changing. The old America of small farms and self-sufficiency was fading, replaced by a new kind of nation, one tied to Washington's hand and pen. But in that fragile moment, the farmers didn't think about what they might lose. They thought about what they'd already lost, and how close they'd come to losing everything. When the first harvest under the new programs came in the fall of 1934, corn prices doubled. For the first time in years, a man could haul his grain to town and come home with his dignity intact. One Iowa farmer told a WPA interviewer later, "I don't know if the president fixed it or if the Lord just gave us another chance. Maybe both." Washington had listened. The question now was, would the farmers remember what their unity had cost and what it had taught them? Because as the New Deal began to settle the nation, the penny auctions and the pitchfork lines faded into the past, half remembered, half buried beneath progress. But in certain counties, men still gathered once a year at the old fairgrounds, shook hands and spoke of those days in the low, steady voices of survivors. They hadn't set out to change the country. They'd only wanted to keep what was theirs. And somehow in doing that, they'd forced the most powerful government in the world to change course. The storms did not end overnight. Even as the ink dried on Roosevelt's New Deal programs, the Midwestern sky still carried the taste of dust, a faint bitterness that coated everything, as if the land itself remembered what had been done to it. But something was shifting, quietly, steadily. By 1935, the sound of hammers began to return to the countryside. Men patched barns that had sagged under years of neglect. They repaired fences, painted weathered siding, and coaxed back what they could of the soil that had betrayed them. The penny auctions had slowed. The sheriff's visits grew rare. And when one did come, he often found a letter from Washington already waiting, a notice that the farmer's debt had been refinanced through the Farm Credit Administration, or that a foreclosure had been delayed under new moratorium laws. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer a fight with fists or pitchforks. It was being won on paper, by signatures, by patience, by persistence. In one small courthouse in Cherokee County, the judge who had once presided over foreclosure sales now presided over loan workouts, shaking the same hands that had once clenched in anger. He told a reporter from the Sioux City Journal, "I used to think these men were troublemakers. Turns out they were just too proud to beg. Maybe we all were." Across the region, that pride, once seen as defiance, became a kind of moral currency. Neighbors still helped neighbors, barn raisings returned, but so did something deeper: cooperation. Farm co-ops spread like prairie fire. Grain elevators were built not by outside investors but by farmers pooling their own dollars, 5 or 10 at a time. They managed them democratically, one vote per man, not per share. They sold collectively, bought seed in bulk, shared tractors, trucks, and advice. The government, for all its reach, couldn't have rebuilt the countryside alone. It was this, the renewed covenant between men and land, and between neighbor and neighbor, that held the Midwest together through the worst of the 1930s. And yet, even amid survival, there was loss. Many who had once stood shoulder to shoulder at penny auctions were gone, moved to California or east to factory jobs, or buried beneath the prairie they refused to abandon. Some farms sat empty, wind whistling through broken boards and doorframes, like monuments to what had been fought for and not quite saved. Those who stayed never forgot. At the 1936 County Fair in Carroll, an old farmer named Henry Larson, the same man whose sale had started the first great penny auction, walked the rows of prize hogs and tractors with his wife Anna. A young reporter recognized him and asked, "Mr. Larson, do you think it was worth it, all those fights, all that trouble?" Henry looked out over the fairgrounds, children laughing, flags flapping, the smell of dust and fried dough, and said quietly, "Worth it. Son, we got to plant again. That's worth everything. Those were the quiet victories, not the headlines, not the speeches. Just the simple return of ordinary life, the right to sow and reap without fear that the land would be taken before the harvest. For every man who'd gone to jail, a dozen others had kept their farms because of him. For every sheriff who'd turned a blind eye at an auction, there were families who stayed on their land another generation. History wouldn't make much noise about it. The school books would call it rural unrest or farm relief. But the men who lived it knew better. They knew it was something older, harder, the American instinct that when the powerful forget fairness, ordinary people must remind them. By 1937, corn prices had doubled again. Farm incomes had risen. Children returned to schools with shoes bought from honest earnings. At last, men could walk into town with cash in their pockets, small, worn bills that smelled faintly of hope. But the land was changing in ways they could not yet see. New machines were arriving, bigger tractors, combines that could do in a day what a team of horses once took a week to finish. Credit, once the enemy, was now the lifeblood of modern farming. And with every passing year, the small farm, the kind built on sweat and community, began to give way to something larger, faster, less personal. The men who had fought the banks had won back their land. But would they recognize what that land was becoming? By the end of the 1930s, the Midwest looked healed from a distance. Grain elevators gleamed again beside the rail lines. Silos stood full. Roads once patrolled by sheriff's convoys now carried trucks hauling corn, hogs, and milk toward rebounding cities. But beneath that new skin, something essential was changing. Quietly, inexorably, as the old way of life that the farmers had fought to save began to vanish beneath the weight of its own recovery. It began with machines. Before the Depression, a man and 2 horses could work 80 acres if he was strong, if the weather was kind, and if luck rode with him. By 1940, a single John Deere Model A could plow, plant, and harvest that same land in half the time. Fuel replaced feed, steel replaced sinew. And where once 10 families worked side by side, now one could manage it alone, or thought he could. Progress had come, but it carried a cruel arithmetic. To afford the new tractors and combines, farmers took out loans. The same banks that had nearly broken them a decade earlier now smiled from behind polished desks, offering modern credit plans and mechanization loans. The men signed, they always had, because what else could they do? The small farm, the 80 or 160-acre homestead passed down through fathers and sons, began to shrink, absorbed piece by piece by those who could afford to modernize faster. In a single decade, 500,000 small farms disappeared across the Midwest. The irony was bitter. The same generation that had fought off the bank's foreclosures now found themselves surrendering to efficiency. No sheriff's sale this time, no crowd, no defiance. Just a handshake, a sigh, and a "well, that's farming now." In Greene County, a man named Elmer Blodgett, who had helped organize the farm holiday roadblocks, sold his last 40 acres in 1941. He told his son, "I beat the bankers, but I can't beat time." He moved to town and took a job at the new tractor plant in Waterloo, building the very machines that were replacing him. Across the region, the rhythms of life changed. The weekly livestock auctions grew smaller. Country stores closed. Schools consolidated as families drifted to cities for steady work. The church parking lots emptied faster on Sundays. Too many miles between neighbors now, too little time. The land remained, but the people changed. And those who stayed learned to work longer hours alone, listening to engines instead of voices, talking to the wind and to God when no one else was near. For some, prosperity came. Those who adapted, who mechanized, expanded, joined co-ops, thrived. New barns went up, electric lines reached the back roads. Radios brought the world into kitchens once lit only by lanterns. There was pride in that too, in surviving, in keeping the farm alive even as the rules changed. But others saw it differently. To them, the America they had fought for during the Depression, the one of neighbors banding together, of honor over profit, was fading. The land was still theirs, yes, but the soul of the work felt rented. Old-timers sitting in the grain co-op cafe would mutter, "We traded our pitchforks for debt notes again, only this time they call it progress." And as war came to Europe and then to America in 1941, many sons of those farmers left the fields altogether, not to save the family place, but to fight for something called freedom, half a world away. When they returned, the land seemed smaller, the work heavier, the silence deeper. By the 1950s, the small farm, that backbone of Jefferson's America, had become more memory than majority. The government that once saved them now governed them through quotas, price supports, and regulations. Fewer and fewer farmers own more and more land. And yet, if you drove through Iowa at sunset, down the gravel roads where the cottonwoods still stood like sentinels, you could still see them. Men in worn coats, standing beside their barns, watching the sky change color over fields that bore their name. They didn't speak of revolt anymore, but deep inside they carried it, that memory of the winter when they had stood against the banks shoulder to shoulder and found the strength to say no. Because for all the machines, the mortgages, and the modernization, one truth remained. The land still answered only to those who worked it. And though the small farm was dying, the idea behind it, that decency and community could stand against power, refused to fade. It lived in every handshake deal, every shared tool, every neighbor who still stopped his tractor when another broke down by the fence line. The fight was over, but the lesson endured. And in the decades that followed, as the old wooden barns fell and the co-ops merged into corporations, those who remembered the 1930s still told the story, usually over coffee, quietly, without bitterness. We didn't win, they'd say, but we didn't lose the way they thought we would. Because even as the world modernized, there were still mornings when a man could walk into his field, feel the soil in his hands, and know that for all its hardship, it was his. The wind never stops in Iowa. It hums through the stubble fields and sighs against the old windmills, carrying with it the stories of men long gone. And if you stand still enough on a cold March morning, you can almost hear them, the echo of auctioneers, the creak of wagon wheels, the low murmur of a crowd gathered not to buy, but to bear witness. 90 years have passed since those days when farmers faced down the banks. The barns are fewer now, the roads wider, the towns quieter. Yet under the black soil, 12 inches of earth that fed a nation, their struggle still lives like a seed that never died. That soil remembers. It remembers the boot prints in the frost outside the Peterson place, where 200 men once stood shoulder to shoulder against the law. It remembers the low chant of $1 rising through the cold air at the Larson auction. The defiant rhythm of decency turned into defense. It remembers the sound of the sheriff's car turning around instead of forward. The land does not forget such things, and neither did the people who stayed. In the years that followed, their children would grow up in a calmer time. Years of plenty, of tractors and television sets, of modern comfort. But every so often, around a kitchen table or a town fair booth, someone would tell the old story. Not like a boast, but like a prayer. There was a time, they'd say, when the banks thought they owned the dirt, and the dirt said otherwise. For the men and women who lived it, the penny auctions and the farm strikes were never about revolution. They were about dignity, about reminding the world that a man's worth couldn't be measured by debt, that fairness mattered more than profit, that neighbors could make a stand without needing permission. The Depression broke many things, fortunes, promises, even faith. But in those frozen counties of the Midwest, it also revealed something unbreakable, a kind of American decency that doesn't shout, doesn't march, but simply refuses to kneel. The records call it farm relief, foreclosure resistance, agrarian protest. But the truth, if you listen close enough, sounds simpler. It was one long season when ordinary people proved that unity could outweigh fear and that courage could be quiet. Today, most of the farms that stood through that time have new owners, new machines, new debts. The penny is gone from the auctions. The courthouse steps are clean, but the soil, that living history of sweat and defiance, still carries their names in silence. Sometimes, when a combine passes over a ridge at sunset and the dust catches the light just right, it looks almost like smoke rising from a fire that never went out. A reminder that somewhere beneath all this progress, the heart of the old struggle still beats. They didn't win a revolution. They didn't topple the system, but they forced it to listen, and that was enough. Because when the banks sent their men and the laws came down cold and hard, the farmers of the Great Depression gave this country something worth more than land or grain or credit. They gave it a memory, the proof that fairness is something worth fighting for, even with nothing left to lose. The fields they saved are quieter now. The barns lean a little, the paint peeled by 1,000 winds. But if you walk through them at dusk, you can feel it, that faint hum in the air, like the earth itself is whispering the old truth one more time. They didn't build it perfect, but they built it honest. And that's what the land remembers. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of those winters, the courage of those farmers, and the meaning of what they stood for, then don't let it fade into silence. History only lives when we keep telling it. So if you believe these stories still matter, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who still believes in hard work, honesty, and the dignity of a man's word. Because out there, in every field, Every small town, every honest pair of hands, the story of America is still being written. And together we'll keep remembering the people who refused to give up their land or their honor.